Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow, as mentioned, marks the 80th anniversary of the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur in Brisbane to establish his headquarters in what was then the AMP building. His office on the 8th floor at 201 Edward Street is now preserved as part of a museum dedicated to the history of Brisbane at war. For many years now, MacArthur Museum has commemorated this event with a formal dinner, with a guest speaker who addresses issues related to the defence of Australia and our relationship with the United States. This year, the directors of the Museum Foundation felt that in view of the significance of this date, there should be something more. A review was proposed of how the alliance between Australia and the United States developed since World War II and where it might go in the future. It should be noted at this stage that MacArthur Museum is a museum and not a memorial. Its aim is to tell the story of Brisbane during the war years and not to eulogise MacArthur himself. Professor Charles Sanford offered to take on this project and sought the support and sponsorship of Griffith University to conduct the conference, which would follow the development of the Australian-American alliance to the present day and look at the challenges for the future. That we're here today is due to the enthusiasm of Charles and the Vice-Chancellor of the University, and on behalf of the MacArthur Museum and its foundation, I thank them most sincerely for the work that they've done. And I'd also like to thank all the staff from Griffith University for their work in bringing this concept to fruition. As an aside, I would point out that Professor Charles has a close association with the General Headquarters Southwest Pacific area through his father, who was a Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve Intelligence Officer on MacArthur's staff. In a way, it's ironic that a museum named MacArthur should co-sponsor a conference on the Australian-American alliance, because MacArthur personally did progressively less and less to nourish it outside a very small circle of Australian friends. When MacArthur arrived, he was welcomed as a hero, the hero of the defence of the Philippines. He was awarded the Medal of Honour in controversial circumstances, but I would suggest that related more to the mechanics of the award than the particular circumstances of his actions. Privately, Roosevelt had said of the defence of the Philippines, it was more of a rout than a military achievement. MacArthur was concerned that he might suffer the same fate as his Hawaiian colleagues, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, and was obsessed with getting back to the Philippines. He was determined to make the reconquest of the Philippines a much higher priority than the combined UK-US services and political chiefs had allocated to it. It seems he hoped that the Australian Prime Minister would be in a better position to influence the decision makers in London and Washington than he could. In this, he was sadly disappointed. He also was dependent on the Australian Army for the bulk of his fighting forces until early 1944, when more US troops started arriving in preparation for the recapture of the Philippines. Despite his dependence on them, credit for their achievement in his regular communiques was sparse, and this became a source of irritation to the Australian Defence Forces and the Australian public in general. Prime Minister John Curtin was the subject of some initial distrust in the US. He was known as an anti-conscriptionist from World War I and had opposed some of the forces being sent overseas in the early stages of World War II. More alarmingly, he was a friend with the Japanese ambassador Kawai and had hosted him at his own home in Western Australia in July of 1941, prior to becoming Prime Minister. As PM, he had entertained Kawai at the lodge in Canberra. It must be said here, though, that Curtin's motivation for this was beyond reproach, but it has been pointed out that it was probably a difficult image to project at that particular time in terms of the impression it made. Curtin seemed to think that the US war hero Douglas MacArthur would be an influential voice within the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that this would see Australia well supported by the US. In fact, MacArthur seems to make the point on several occasions that US forces were not here to defend Australia per se, but to build up a base to strike back at Imperial Japan. At Tarawi, in South Australia, where he makes his famous "I shall return" speech, there's no mention of defending Australia, although it would have to be considered an adjunct to the actual building up of a base. But at the 26th of March meeting of the War Advisory Council, MacArthur suggests that the Japanese would not invade Australia because the rewards were not worth the risk. When MacArthur and Curtin met in the aftermath of the submarine attack in Sydney Harbour, May 31st to the 1st of June 1942, Curtin is told that the Commonwealth has responsibility to defend Australia, but due to its strategic location, US forces would be in Australia, irrespective of the American relationship to the people who might be occupying Australia. Despite limited interaction during World War I, the vast majority of the peoples of the US and Australia knew very little of each other before World War II. Australia's dependence on the British Empire and the American retreat into isolationism inhibited the development of intergovernment talks on defence ties until the outbreak of the war in 1939, and even then they were fairly small level of interaction until the war in the Pacific became more imminent. And I won't go into the operational difficulties experienced in Southwest Pacific area, as I'm sure this will be addressed elsewhere. And in general, while there were instances of friction between the armed forces of the two nations in Australia, it's said that the closer you got to the front line, the higher the level of cooperation. It seems that initially, rather than alliance in the traditional sense, there was a marriage of convenience, from which, at least on the Australian side, the idea of a long-time alliance was born. The marriage of convenience was not entirely infertile in the long term. It planted the seeds of a stronger relationship between the two nations as Americans became more aware that there was another friendly nation in the South Pacific with whom they shared a number of political, cultural and legal similarities. The rapid Japanese advances of late 41 and up to mid-42 emphasised the importance of a defensible base in the South Pacific to the US government. And this became especially relevant as the Cold War started to develop. It seems to many Australians, especially those who fought alongside them, the most vivid impression they had was of the unstoppable power of the US once it set its collective mind to the war effort. At the political level, this translated into the importance of a formal defensive alliance with the US. And finally, in 1951, the circumstances were favourable to such an alliance. The ANZUS Treaty was signed on the 1st of September 1951, exactly a week before the Treaty of San Francisco, which formally ended World War II. With such an accomplished group of speakers, I'm sure we will find the discussion of the events that followed MacArthur's arrival interesting and informative. Thank you for your attendance and your attention, whether remotely or in person.